Sergeant Jack Harris never imagined his hardest battle would be fought in a courtroom, not on the battlefield. At stake was Max, his canine partner, who had once dragged him from gunfire and shielded him from death. The Army said Max belonged to them. Jack said Max was his brother. And then, before the ruling could be read, Max exposed a deadly secret hiding in plain sight. What followed changed everything. Watch closely, and if you believe loyalty is stronger than law, like this video, and subscribe for more stories that must be told. The courthouse in Raleigh, North Carolina, bore the gravity of an old church. The ceiling was high windows tall, and the benches polished by decades of restless hands. On this brisk Monday morning, the air was charged with an expectation that went beyond the formality of law. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder with veterans in caps, young lawyers, and curious townsfolk. They had not come for a routine case. They had come to watch whether a war hero would be stripped of the one companion who had never left his side. At the defense table sat Sergeant Jack Harris. His suit was neat navy blue, but the way he adjusted his collar and kept his cane close betrayed the scars of years in uniform. His posture carried discipline, though his left leg trembled faintly when he rose. At his side rested Max, a German shepherd with a thick coat muzzle flecked with gray, and eyes that seemed to scan every corner of the room with the patience of a seasoned soldier. The leash hung loosely from Jack's hand, less restraint than bond, as though both man and dog knew it symbolized loyalty rather than control. Across the aisle sat Colonel Davis of the Military Working Dog Program. His uniform was immaculate, his ribbons aligned in perfect rows, his face composed. To his right, a young captain scribbled notes, though his eyes flicked often toward Max. Behind them, folders were stacked neatly, evidence ready to argue that Max was not a partner or a friend, but a government asset trained costly and still fit for service. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. "All rise." The room stood as Judge Whitaker entered. He was tall, with silver hair and the bearing of a man who had spent a lifetime in service to something greater than himself. His robe flowed, yet his movements were deliberate, steady. When he settled at the bench, he peered at the room over his glasses. "We are here today to decide the custody of military working dog Max," he announced, his tone neither cold nor warm, simply weighty. Ellen Pierce, Jack's attorney, rose first. She was sharp-measured, every movement controlled. "Your Honor," she began, "we request that Max be retired and released into Sergeant Harris's care. Max has completed multiple combat tours, saved American lives, and has been critical to Sergeant Harris's recovery since his return from service. To separate them now would be detrimental to both man and dog." She slid photographs across to the clerk, images of Max on dusty airstrips, sitting patiently beside crates of gear, eyes fixed on a horizon that was never safe. She also submitted a letter from Jack's doctor at the VA. The words were clinical reduced panic attacks, improved sleep patterns, but between the lines was something simpler. Max gave Jack a reason to wake in the morning. Colonel Davis stood his presence calm but firm. "Your Honor, we recognize Max's record and Sergeant Harris's service. However, Max remains a military asset trained at significant expense, still capable of deployment. The Army must allocate resources according to mission requirements. Sentiment cannot override procedure." His words carried no malice, but they landed like cold iron. The judge listened, nodding, then turned to Jack. "Sergeant Harris, I'll hear from you." Jack rose slowly, his cane steadying him. He buttoned his jacket, cleared his throat. His voice was low but sure. "Your Honor, Max and I served 3 tours together. He found wires invisible to the eye. He sensed traps where I saw nothing. Once he pulled me away from a doorway seconds before it blew. He took shrapnel that could have ended me. And when I came home, when I couldn't sleep, when I couldn't look at myself in the mirror, Max was there. He rests his head on my chest when the nightmares come. He grounds me." Jack's gaze shifted to the dog, then back to the bench. I know the Army sees numbers equipment, but I was trained to bring my people home. Max is my people. He's earned his peace. Please let me give him that." The room held its breath. A woman in the gallery dabbed her eyes. A veteran in the back straightened his cap in his hands. The judge tapped his pen lightly on the desk, then leaned over his papers. He reached for the order sheet, his pen poised. Jack sat down, his hand resting on Max's back. The dog's body, usually calm, stiffened beneath his touch. Max lifted his head ears, pricking sharply. His nostrils flared as if catching a scent invisible to human senses. Jack felt it instantly, the leash tightening the shift from rest to alert. He whispered, "Easy, boy," but Max was no longer focused on him. His gaze fixed forward past the flags flanking the judge toward the rear door of the courtroom. Then came the sound, faint, metallic, a latch clicking softly at the back. Subtle enough to blend with courthouse noises, but Max recognized it. His body surged upright, tail-rigid chest heaving. A deep, sudden bark erupted sharp and commanding, startling the silence into chaos. Another bark followed, then a low, rolling growl that seemed to vibrate the very wood beneath them. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The bailiffs moved quickly, hands hovering over their weapons, eyes darting to the rear of the room. Colonel Davis frowned, his jaw tightening as though the sound reminded him of dusty roads and hidden threats. Ellen gripped her pen so tightly it nearly snapped. Judge Whitaker froze. His pen halted above the page. He turned his eyes to Max, then to Jack. "Sergeant Harris," he said evenly, though the strain in his voice was clear. "Is your dog under control?" Jack's hand held firm on the leash, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. He's under control. But he's not mistaken. He only does this when there's danger." The judge hesitated, his eyes narrowing. The room had shifted. What moments before had been a legal debate now felt like something more immediate, more primal. Every ear strained toward the rear door. Max's growl deepened relentless, his gaze locked. Judge Whitaker lowered his pen and looked to the bailiffs. "Check the rear entrance. Carefully." His tone was sharp, commanding. The bailiffs obeyed, moving toward the door as the gallery held its collective breath. Jack tightened his grip, whispering to Max, "Good boy. Stay with me." He knew, as he always had, that the dog was never wrong. The courthouse had not returned to calm after Max's sudden eruption. Judge Whitaker had ordered a recess, and the bailiffs checked the rear entrance while people in the gallery leaned close to one another, whispering guesses about what had provoked the German shepherd. Jack Harris remained at the defense table, one hand wrapped around the leash, steadying both himself and Max. The dog sat upright, ears pricked, gaze still fixed toward the back of the courtroom, as though he refused to let go of the signal he had caught. Outside, security spread along the perimeter. The air was sharp, with autumn chill leaves swirling across the courthouse steps. It was there that Officer Ramirez noticed a figure lingering near the side gate. The man was dressed plainly, gray jacket, worn shoes, but his pacing betrayed nervous energy. His eyes darted from window to door, and every few seconds he pressed his satchel closer to his chest. Ramirez called out, asking for identification. The man hesitated, gave a vague answer, and shifted his weight like someone ready to bolt. Within moments, 2 more officers converged. Their questions grew firmer. The man finally produced an ID, but it did not match the documents Ramirez glimpsed sticking out of the satchel. The officers confiscated the bag and escorted him inside. When the bailiff whispered in Judge Whitaker's ear, the judge's expression tightened. He tapped his gavel once. "This court will resume. An individual has been detained outside with materials of possible relevance. He will be brought in for identification." The gallery stirred, voices rising and falling until silenced by another rap of the gavel. The side doors opened and 2 officers entered with the man between them. He was in his 40s, average height, hair combed neatly but his face pale with fatigue. Without his satchel, he looked diminished, though his eyes carried a flicker of defiance. The bag was placed on a small table beside the bench. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. "State your name for the record." The man cleared his throat. Daniel Cross. His voice was low, steady, but edged with something that made people listen. He glanced once at Max, and the dog answered with a low growl restrained only by Jack's firm hand. The judge folded his hands. Mr. Cross, you were observed loitering outside the courthouse and found with documents marked as classified. Explain yourself. Cross drew a breath, glanced at the gallery, then back at the bench. I came because the truth about that dog is being buried. Max isn't only a war hero. He's part of something the Army doesn't want in daylight. Gasps rippled through the benches. Ellen Pierce immediately rose. Your Honor, this man's presence is highly irregular. He has no standing in this case. We request that his claims be disregarded until his identity is verified. Colonel Davis stood as well, his jaw tight. The Army disavows this individual. Possession of restricted documents is a federal offense. His statements are baseless and dangerous. Whitaker raised his hand to quiet them. The court will determine relevance. Mr. Cross, proceed carefully. Cross straightened his shoulders. You call Max a military asset. To Sergeant Harris, he is a partner. Both are true, but there is more. Max was part of a program that classified dogs not as companions, not even as soldiers, but as tools to be cycled endlessly. These papers, he nodded toward the satchel detail directives for extended deployments, no retirement, constant reassignment. Dogs like Max were never meant to grow old beside their handlers. They were meant to be recycled until they broke. The gallery erupted again. A veteran muttered angrily while reporters bent furiously over their notepads. Judge Whitaker signaled for order. Ellen spoke firmly. Your Honor, without authentication, these are just words. We cannot derail proceedings over unverified claims. But Jack could not stay silent. He rose slowly, one hand on the table for balance, the other gripping the leash. His voice was calm but cut through the room. With respect, Your Honor. Max isn't theory. He's real. I've seen what he's done. He's not a piece of equipment. He's a life. Cross turned toward him. And that's why they fear you having him. Because once the public sees what these dogs are, loyal, irreplaceable partners who choose their humans, it undermines the entire system that treats them as property. Colonel Davis's face was unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than denial. He did not rise again. His gaze stayed fixed on the satchel lips pressed in a thin line. The judge motioned to the bailiff. Secure those documents. We will review them in chambers. Still, the effect was already spreading. The spectators no longer looked at the attorneys or the judge. Their eyes were on Max, who sat steady gaze locked on Cross, his growl quiet but present. It was as if the dog understood the weight of the words spoken. Cameras clicked. Reporters whispered headlines under their breath. And though the gavel came down to restore control, the sense in the room had changed. This was no longer just about whether a soldier could keep his dog. Something larger was unfolding, and everyone knew it. Jack waited until the satchel was sealed and the last murmur faded. Then he rose with care and asked to continue. And when Judge Whitaker nodded, he faced the bench and spoke in a steady voice that belonged to field briefings rather than speeches, saying the court deserved more than generalities, saying it needed to see the day he owed his life to the dog at his heel. He set the scene without ornament. Kandahar Province, second tour. A July noon that pressed heat into the road so hard the rubber soles felt soft. A patrol tasked with clearing an approach route for an aid convoy irrigation ditches, running low on either side walls of sun-baked brick, offering the kind of cover that disappoints when metal flies and a wind that carried dust and the faint metallic thread that always made the hairs on his arms stand up. Max worked the leash with intent head low ears forward, sampling air and ground. Not hunting people, hunting the unnatural. And Jack followed because that was the job handler and dog in a Rhythm 2 practiced to explain. The radio crackled with routine calls, then clipped to silence. And in that small hush, Max veered to the right, pulled tight and planted, and Jack shifted with him just as the road behind them lifted in a blunt roar that punched breath from his lungs, the blast spraying stones and dry soil and the shredded remains of what some careful hands had hidden under the surface. Men dropping to knees, a medic yelling for a count, and another device thumping farther down the line like a cruel echo. Jack tried to rise and felt his left knee fail sharp pain and sudden heat rushing through the joint, and in the gray ring of vision he saw Max come back through the grit with shoulders low and eyes unblinking, teeth finding the drag handle on Jack's vest, hauling him toward the lee of a wall with a strength that belonged to work and will not adrenaline alone. Shrapnel traced a rough arc and carved into Max's flank darkening fur, yet the dog did not break. He braced and pulled until Jack's boots cleared the open, then turned his body to cover chest forward, head angled toward the road, as if daring the dust to move wrong again. Medics reached them and triaged the human first, but Jack would not let the hands that wrapped his knee ignore the dog bleeding against his thigh, and a corpsman pressed a bandage along Max's side while another checked for entry wounds. Then they loaded both onto the bird, the rotors beating a hard promise into the sky. Recovery took time. Neither man nor dog had intended to spend physical therapy. Teaching Jack's leg its duty, again veterinary surgery, closing a jagged line that still shows if Max rolls. Just so, and through months that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. The dog learned the nights that threatened to undo the days, laying his head on Jack's chest, when breathing shortened, bringing him back from the places. Silence can trap a person. Jack finished the account with the simple truth that equipment does not drag you out of fire and guard you while it bleeds, that equipment does not wake when your breath stumbles and steady you with its own. And he looked down at Max once, then up at the bench and said he was trained to bring his people home and that the court should allow him to do that now. Ellen Pierce let the words sit, then signaled she had nothing further on that point, and the gallery held still as if a room could nod. But before the judge could frame a question, Colonel Davis rose and asked to address the court, received leave and stepped to the lectern with a measured calm that did not hide urgency. He stated that no one doubted the sergeant's account or the dog's courage. Then he said, context mattered that Max had been selected for advanced workups beyond the standard military working dog curriculum that he had been imprinted on extended explosive scent libraries, drilled in pattern recognition against decoy environments, proofed under layered distractions, cross-trained for route clearance where most dogs never serve, and evaluated as an exceptional performer whose instincts had been shaped and reinforced by a program designed for missions still underway. He emphasized that such training creates capabilities the Army is obligated to manage, that releasing a dog with Max's profile into private custody would compromise readiness and set a precedent that would ripple through handler assignments, procurement cycles, and interagency operations, and he concluded that national security could not bend to individual circumstances, no matter how compelling. Ellen stood where she was and answered without heat. That training explains what a dog can do, but not why he does it for one person through pain and fear. That the record already showed clinically measurable benefits to Sergeant Harris when Max remained nearby, that the Army's retirement statute does not require endless reassignment when a dog has served beyond any reasonable expectation, and that dignity for veterans and their partners is itself a public interest the court can recognize. Davis replied that alleged documents about policy should not color the decision until authenticated that discipline requires processes and that the same country that honors courage must also honor rules. Jack asked for permission to respond and received it. Then he said briefly that the Army taught Max to find what others miss, but no one taught Max to choose him in the moments when choosing meant pain, and that choice repeated over years is the bond the court is being asked to respect. Judge Whitaker leaned back and considered both the policy and the blood. then stated for the record that he would hold a narrow evidentiary hearing on the nature and scope of Max's specialized training and on whether those facts, if proven legally, bar retirement to a former handler under applicable regulations, and he instructed counsel to prepare witnesses and records for that purpose while he reviewed the sealed materials in chambers with opportunities for objection. He asked the bailiffs to maintain the perimeter and requested that Sergeant Harris keep Max close and calm during the recess. A deputy acknowledged and moved to the corridor, and the sound of his radio faded as doors swung on their hinges. Jack eased back into his chair and rested his hand on Max's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall that had carried him through more nights than he would admit. While across the aisle, Davis conferred quietly with the captain, their notes filling with references and program codes, and Ellen opened a thin folder marked with tabs, choosing which page would speak first when the hearing resumed and the judge gathered his files. Eyes pausing on the photograph of the dog seated between dusty boots. Before he rose to step down for Chambers, leaving the room. Balanced between two truths that would have to be tested, one about training and one about loyalty, and the hallway outside began to collect footsteps that did not belong to any of them, footsteps that would matter when the next session called them back. The recess broke the courtroom into a low hum of footsteps and murmurs, as clerks, attorneys, and onlookers spilled into the marble corridor, and the air smelled of damp wool and toner, while a chill draft slipped under the north entrance doors. Jack kept Max at heel as Ellen Pierce walked beside them, laying out witness order for the evidentiary hearing Judge Whitaker had scheduled, and Colonel Davis conferred with his captain near a bulletin board, thick with outdated notices. But everything shifted. The moment Max paused, mid-stride, lifted his head and drew a long, deliberate breath that tightened the leash in Jack's palm like a quiet alarm. Jack felt the change and told the nearest deputy in an even tone that avoided panic that Max had gone to a passive explosives alert, and as if on cue, the dog tracked 3 steps forward, sat squarely, closed his mouth, and fixed his gaze on a low bench beside the glass doors that opened to the courthouse steps. The deputy's posture straightened the casual cadence of recess shed like a coat, and he held up a hand to pause traffic while his partner radioed the desk, called for a sweep, and asked everyone to hold position. Judge Whitaker stepped from Chambers, saw the still dog and the crowd beginning to ripple, and moved quickly to the deputy for a clipped briefing before ordering calm, restricting movement and instructing that nothing near the bench be touched. And when a clerk mentioned a taped carton noticed 5 minutes earlier and mistaken for a courier drop, the judge's jaw tightened while Jack shortened the leash and kept Max's sit steady with soft praise. City EOD officers arrived with compact kits and a professionalism that settled the corridor's edges, and the lead technician took a long look at Max's line of sight, then crouched at distance with a telescoping mirror to inspect the space under the bench where a shoebox parcel wrapped in brown paper with clear tape at the seams sat in plain view, as if it belonged to no one and everyone. The team established a hot zone around the bench, and a warm zone down the hall rolled in a small robot and slid a portable X-ray plate beneath the package, and when the tablet image resolved, the lead's voice lost all pretense of routine as he reported a power source, wiring a switching mechanism consistent with a phone trigger metal fragment filler and small cylinders positioned to amplify the blast. He called the device viable and asked for a water disruptor, and as the team set the charge with a practiced choreography of gloved hands and short commands, the gallery's whisper thinned to a careful silence that felt like prayer. The disruptor fired with a sharp report. The robot's camera showed the parcel burst and wiring severed, and the updated X-ray confirmed the initiator neutralized while an ugly scatter of bolts and nuts rolled onto the tile where the bench cast a shadow, and the lead tech exhaled. Said the device would have sent fragments across the corridor at chest height had it detonated when recess ended, and added that the north doors typically saw the heaviest traffic at the top of the hour. The exterior post reported that a bus of schoolchildren on a civics tour had been on the steps 15 minutes earlier and scheduled to re-enter for the judge's next docket, and a deputy closed his eyes for a beat before widening the perimeter to the outside landing. Judge Whitaker thanked the EOD team with a gravity that needed no flourish, ordered the building into restricted movement, and told the record keeper to note that a credible threat had been disrupted on the basis of Max's trained alert. He asked the marshal's representative to coordinate with federal partners and preserve all physical evidence, and the deputy photographed a narrow strip of tape still clinging to the underside of the bench, along with a torn corner of a label bearing a partial barcode, and the letters CO bagged both and logged them. Jack knelt beside Max and pressed a palm to the dog's shoulder while offering a collapsible bowl, and Max drank, then lifted his head and resumed his calm survey of the hallway as if work stayed work until told otherwise. Davis approached and spoke quietly that the alert had been textbook, and that he did not dispute what he had seen while Ellen steadied a trembling young clerk and then studied the field tape that now boxed out the bench like a scar. The second EOD tech swept for a secondary device with the robot's camera found none, and marked the floor where fragments had scattered, and the marshal's representative phone to ear relayed that an exterior camera had captured a figure in a maintenance jacket, placing the parcel and stepping away with his hood up the patch on the jacket, showing the name of a private contractor that serviced several federal buildings, the face hidden, but the gait distinctive and the right hand bandaged across the knuckles. The representative asked for the contractor's current field roster and vehicle list, and called in the license plate of a box truck seen circling the block too slowly. The judge directed counsel to return to the courtroom once the corridor cleared and said the hearing would resume when safe with the events of the recess included in the custody record, and he reminded everyone that motive would not be speculated upon from the bench without evidence. The deputies began moving small groups back toward the double doors, and people obeyed because the voice of procedure sounded like common sense after hearing that the parcel had been real, and Daniel Cross lifted a hand to speak, but a deputy asked him to hold his statement for the record, and he nodded eyes on Max with something like respect, shading whatever agenda he carried. Jack Rose carefully brought Max to heel and felt the tension in the leash ease into a practiced calm, while Ellen murmured that the day had reframed everything, and Davis stood a moment longer watching the bagged tape fragment, as if it might explain more than it could before returning to his table and jotting the same contractor name that sat in the marshal's notebook. The EOD team rolled the robot back to its case, and the clerk announced the court would reconvene in 5 minutes if the hall remained clear, and in that brief span the flag outside cracked once in the wind. A delivery truck idled too near the curb. A camera down the block caught a maintenance jacket sliding into the rear of a vehicle that did not belong to the county, and somewhere a phone vibrated on a belt with a text that would decide who came through the doors next. The hearing resumed under heavier guard, the corridor still echoing with the memory of the neutralized bomb. Judge Whitaker reminded everyone that the court would address only matters of fact, yet his tone carried the steel of a man who knew the stakes had risen far beyond a simple custody case. Jack sat at the defense table with Max close at his side. The shepherd's posture was steady, though his gaze lingered on every doorway as if the hallway might breathe danger back into the room. Ellen Pierce arranged her notes, but her hand trembled slightly before she clasped it tight. Colonel Davis kept his composure, though he glanced more often than before at the gallery where journalists had filled every space, their pens and cameras ready to seize any turn. The marshal's representative stepped forward with a report. Security footage showed a figure in a contractor's jacket placing the explosive parcel. The badge on the sleeve bore the initials of a company tied to federal defense contracts. The judge asked for the name. The representative answered with quiet precision. Orion Solutions, a private firm involved in logistics and canine procurement programs. A ripple of whispers cut through the benches. Daniel Cross stood and requested to be heard. Whitaker granted him limited time. Cross stated that Orion Solutions had for months pressed to acquire specific military working dogs deemed exceptional dogs like Max. He said they weren't interested in companionship or service honors, but in using those animals for private security operations where oversight was thin and profit margins wide. Ellen rose swiftly. Your Honor, this confirms what we feared. The attempt to reassign Max isn't simply about regulation. It is part of a coordinated effort to pull him from Sergeant Harris and place him in hands with questionable motives. She requested that the affidavit she had filed under seal be admitted. Whitaker signaled for the clerk to read its summary. The affidavit alleged that Edward Collins, a senior figure linked to Orion, had offered money to a procurement officer in exchange for early notice of dogs marked for retirement. The document specifically named Max as a target of those inquiries. The gallery turned as one toward Collins, who sat in the second row, immaculate in his tailored suit, silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He rose deliberately, his expression neutral, and addressed the judge. These allegations are without merit. I am here merely as an observer. His voice was calm, almost practiced, but the unease beneath it was palpable. Ellen countered immediately. Observers do not pay visits to procurement officers in Arlington hotels. Observers do not wire funds through shell companies tied to canine training facilities overseas. This affidavit is sworn under penalty of perjury. Colonel Davis shifted in his chair, visibly caught between the rigid duty of defending procedure and the uncomfortable reality of corruption bleeding into his world. He stood asking to clarify that the Army did not sanction or condone any private deals, but the judge cut him short. Colonel, we will address Army policy in due time. Right now, this court will focus on the integrity of this proceeding. His eyes returned to Collins. Sir, do you deny contact with procurement officers in connection with Max Collins's jaw moved, but his words stumbled. He repeated that he was being maligned by a man of no standing and a lawyer trying to sway sympathy. Daniel Cross interjected, voice steady. I was part of those negotiations until I walked away. Collins's firm wanted dogs for tasks the Army refused to authorize: surveillance, intimidation, even covert operations in regions where official presence is politically untenable. Max was the prize because his record showed an instinct beyond training. His words carried a sharp edge that made several veterans in the gallery stiffen. Judge Whitaker ordered the marshals to take Collins into custody for questioning his patience with denials drained by the weight of documents and testimony now before him. The gallery erupted with noise flashes from cameras strobing the chamber as two deputies moved down the aisle toward the contractor. Collins's composed mask slipped. His eyes darted toward the exit before settling back on Max, who had risen silently to his feet, body rigid, eyes locked on the man. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath as man and dog faced one another, the silence punctuated only by the click of a reporter's camera. Collins finally spoke, voice sharp. You don't understand what that animal represents. He isn't just a companion. He's capability. He's leverage. You can't let him walk out of here. The words hung heavy, and for the first time there was no attempt at pretense. The marshals gripped his arms and escorted him out, his voice trailing as he repeated that Max was too valuable to be left in civilian hands. Whitaker leaned forward, pen set aside. This court is now aware that outside interests are seeking custody of Max for purposes beyond any lawful framework. This changes the scope of these proceedings. He ordered the marshal's office to coordinate with federal investigators. He warned every party present that interference would be treated as criminal contempt. Then he looked directly at Jack. Sergeant Harris, the safety of your partner is now under greater scrutiny than before. The record will reflect both his service and the threats made against him. Jack nodded, his hand firm on the leash. He did not speak, but the weight of the moment settled in his chest. Max leaned gently against his leg the way he had countless nights when nightmares threatened to steal breath from his lungs. The courtroom, once a place of arguments and law, now felt like a battlefield of a different sort, one where loyalty and corruption had collided in plain sight. The clerk called the room back to order, but the whisper of speculation refused to die. Reporters huddled at the back, already forming headlines. Ellen quietly told Jack that the fight had changed again. They weren't just defending Max's retirement, they were protecting him from being stolen into a world darker than war. Davis scribbled notes furiously, perhaps preparing to distance the army from the scandal now unfolding. Cross remained silent, his eyes steady as though bracing for what he knew would come next. The courtroom had not yet recovered from the shock of Collins being escorted out when Judge Whitaker returned to the bench, his face stern, his gavel striking once to command silence. He declared that outside interference had been revealed, and that the focus of the court was now on facts that could no longer be treated as abstract. Ellen Pierce rose to address the judge but stopped when Jack shifted forward, bracing himself with his cane, his other hand steady on Max's leash. He asked for permission to speak directly. The judge studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. Jack took a breath, squared his shoulders, and let his voice cut clearly across the room. Max is not property. He is not an asset to be transferred from file to file. He is my brother. His words carried the plain tone of truth, not polished for law, but forged in the dust of battlefields. The gallery reacted immediately, murmurs swelling, veterans straightening in their seats, civilians leaning forward as though they had been waiting for someone to put into words what they had all felt but not said. A man in uniform in the back row clapped once sharply, and then others followed until the room was full of sound that no gavel could quiet. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the line would be tomorrow's headline. Judge Whitaker rapped his gavel but did not silence the room. Instead, he let the sound roll and then settled his gaze on Jack. Sergeant, the record will reflect your statement. Do you wish to add anything further? Jack nodded. I swore an oath to bring my people home. Max brought me home. That bond is not negotiable. The judge inclined his head, then reminded the room that the law would determine the outcome, but the sentiment had been marked. As the applause slowly faded, Max shifted his posture. His body stiffened, ears pricked, and his gaze locked across the gallery. Jack felt the leash tighten slightly, the vibration of muscle traveling through leather into his palm. Max's throat rumbled low, a growl that was not theatrical but purposeful. Jack followed the line of the dog's stare and saw a man near the end of the third row, his posture hunched, his coat too heavy for the season. The judge noticed the disruption and called for order, but the deputies had already caught the signal. One moved swiftly down the aisle, another circled from the side. Max's growl deepened as the man shifted his hand, slipping toward his jacket. The deputy shouted for him to freeze. The man's eyes widened. His movement faltered, and within seconds he was pressed against the bench, his arms pulled back. From his coat, the deputies drew a concealed pistol wrapped in a cloth. Gasps filled the room. The gallery leaned back in shock, mothers clutching children, veterans rising instinctively before settling again. The judge's face hardened. Remove him from this courtroom at once. The deputies obeyed, dragging the man through the side door as he protested in silence, his words lost beneath the renewed noise. Ellen seized the moment to remind the court that twice now Max had prevented disaster, first with the explosive outside, and now with a concealed weapon inside. If there is any doubt, she said firmly, about who Max is and what he represents, let it be erased. He is not simply trained. He is devoted. He is vigilant in ways that keep every one of us safe. Colonel Davis stood visibly shaken, but still clinging to formality. No one disputes his vigilance, counselor, but the very fact that Max detects and responds to threats beyond ordinary perception is precisely why the Army cannot treat him as a private companion. He is a national resource. Jack cut in with quiet force. A resource doesn't look into your eyes when you can't find the will to breathe. A resource doesn't stand between you and a bullet with no order given. Max does those things because he chooses to, not because a manual taught him how. The gallery murmured again, the sound now less of curiosity and more of conviction. Reporters wrote faster, and one elderly veteran rose, saluted toward Jack, and said with a breaking voice, "You speak for all of us who had someone watch our backs." The judge signaled for silence, but the tide in the room had shifted. Public sentiment had become a force of its own, and Whitaker knew it. He tapped his pen against the desk and ordered that the weapon seized be logged as evidence. He instructed the marshals to trace its serial number and determine how it had entered the building. He also directed the clerk to note Max's second intervention in the record. Jack lowered himself back into his seat, his hand steady on Max's head. The shepherd's breathing slowed, but his eyes remained sharp, still sweeping the room even after the man had been removed. Ellen leaned closer to Jack and whispered that every threat revealed by Max only strengthened their argument. Jack whispered back, "Every threat makes me fear more for him." Colonel Davis turned slightly toward the gallery, his expression no longer composed but shadowed with unease, as if he too recognized that the battlefield had shifted into places no regulation could fully reach. Cross watched silently, his gaze fixed on the door where the armed man had been taken, his jaw clenched as though the pieces of the puzzle were becoming too clear. Judge Whitaker recessed the hearing briefly, his voice grave as he ordered tighter security and demanded a full sweep of the courthouse. Jack exhaled, resting his palm on Max's shoulder, and told him softly, "You did good again, buddy." Max leaned against his leg, eyes unblinking as the sound of hurried footsteps and radio chatter filled the hallway beyond the closed doors, signaling that the day was not finished with them yet. The courtroom returned from the security sweep under stricter control, with deputies at every door and the gallery seated in uneasy silence after the arrest of the armed man. Judge Whitaker took his place again, his expression grave, and declared the hearing resumed. He noted for the record that outside interference would not halt the proceedings, and that the court's task remained to establish rightful custody of Max under law. Ellen Pierce prepared her notes. Jack kept Max calm with a hand on the shepherd's back, and Colonel Davis shifted with restrained formality. Then the clerk announced the next witness called by the Army Captain Robert Miller. The sound of the name drew a subtle reaction from Jack. He remembered Miller from the training grounds years ago, the officer who had overseen Max's earliest drills, who had graded both handler and dog with cold precision. Miller entered wearing his uniform, pressed sharp metals, pinned neatly, and carried the bearing of a man who knew his words could cut. He raised his hand, swore his oath, and took the stand. Ellen's eyes narrowed as she studied him, sensing the weight of what was coming. Colonel Davis's counsel asked Miller to describe Max's origins. Miller spoke firmly without hesitation, explaining that Max had been selected from a litter for traits of discipline and focus, that he had been trained under federal funding, imprinted with explosives, scents, drilled in obedience protocols, and conditioned through Army resources. He is, by all definitions, Miller declared government property. Regulations are clear. Until formally retired, such a dog remains in the custody of the United States Army. Sergeant Harris's claim, however heartfelt, does not supersede law. His words landed like stones calculated to strip sentiment from the case. The gallery stirred, uneasy but attentive. Jack clenched his jaw but remained silent until Whitaker allowed cross-examination. Ellen rose and asked pointedly whether Miller had seen Max's actions beyond training, whether he had ever witnessed the dog make a choice not dictated by conditioning. Miller dodged, saying only that instincts were sharpened by drills, not by anything mystical. His testimony was a direct blow to Jack's plea. Veterans in the gallery muttered softly, feeling the sting of regulations used against loyalty. Whitaker leaned back, steepling his fingers, weighing the cold authority of law against the warmth of lived experience. Before Ellen could press further, a commotion stirred near the clerk's desk. A young marshal entered holding a sealed folder and whispered urgently to the judge. Whitaker frowned, broke the seal, and scanned the contents. His eyes hardened. He instructed the clerk to read aloud the summary for the record. The room leaned in. The document was a financial record obtained through investigative channels showing transfers from an account tied to Orion Solutions into a private account belonging to Captain Robert Miller. The payments were marked as consulting fees, but aligned perfectly with dates of procurement reviews for specialized dogs, including Max. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Ellen froze, then quickly pivoted to face Miller. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice carrying both sharpness and restraint. "Can you explain why funds from a private contractor appear in your account on the very dates you were advising on Max's reassignment?" Miller's face tightened. He shifted in his seat, stammered about legitimate consulting, but the judge's voice cut through. "Captain, you are under oath." The silence that followed was suffocating. Miller's eyes darted briefly toward Colonel Davis, but the colonel's expression was stone, offering no lifeline. Cross leaned forward from his bench, watching with the intensity of someone who had expected this moment. Ellen pressed further. "You testified that Sergeant Harris's bond with Max does not matter because regulation is clear. But what about your bond to integrity, Captain? What about the regulation that bars an officer from taking payment from outside firms? Did that not apply to you?" The gallery erupted again, some spectators voicing outrage, others whispering that the entire proceeding had been compromised. The judge struck his gavel hard. "Order! This is a court of law." But the damage was done. Miller's credibility had shattered before the room. Jack looked at Miller with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You trained him," Jack said quietly, though the words carried. "You knew what he was, and you sold him anyway." Miller's face flushed, but he did not answer. The judge ordered the marshals to detain Miller for questioning pending further investigation into bribery and conflict of interest. The gallery burst into applause uncontainable, the force of betrayed trust finding release. Whitaker let it go for a moment before restoring calm. Ellen turned to the bench. "Your Honor, this revelation confirms what we have argued all along. Max is not simply being held under regulation. He is being targeted by corruption and private interest. Sergeant Harris stands against this not only for himself, but for the principle that loyalty and sacrifice cannot be auctioned." The judge nodded gravely. "The record will reflect that testimony against Sergeant Harris has been tainted by evidence of financial impropriety. This court will not allow betrayal of duty to masquerade as lawful procedure." He ordered Miller removed, then directed the hearing to continue with focus on what remained credible. Jack sat back slowly, Max pressing against his leg as though sensing the storm's shift. Ellen leaned close, her whisper sharp with determination. "They're running out of shields. All that's left is their desperation." Colonel Davis shifted uncomfortably, his role now precarious in the shadow of exposed corruption. Cross exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as if recognizing that the battle was far from over. The judge prepared to call the next phase, but the sudden arrival of another deputy with a sealed envelope hinted that the revelations were not yet finished. The courthouse released its crowd under a gray sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the residue of revelations and betrayal. Reporters clustered on the steps, their questions rising like a storm, but Jack ignored them, leaning on his cane with Max at his side, Ellen Pierce guiding them toward the waiting vehicle. The shepherd walked steady despite the chaos, scanning faces, ears flicking at each shout from the crowd. Deputies formed a loose corridor, their radios crackling with updates about Collins and Miller. Jack kept his focus on the car waiting at the curb, but his instincts sharpened as the press of people closed in. Max stopped abruptly, muscles tight. Jack felt the warning through the leash an instant before a figure broke from the side, a man in a dark jacket pushing hard through the deputies. His hand flashed with steel, a knife angled toward Jack's chest. There was no time for thought. Max lunged forward with a force that yanked Jack off balance. The blade met fur and muscle instead of flesh. The shepherd's body absorbed the strike, a sharp yelp cutting through the roar of the crowd. Chaos exploded. Deputies tackled the assailant, driving him to the ground as the knife clattered across the stone steps. Reporters screamed, cameras clicking like frantic insects. Jack dropped to one knee, pulling Max close, his hands pressing against the dog's side where blood seeped dark and fast. "Stay with me, buddy," Jack whispered, voice cracking his training fighting with panic. Medics rushed from the rear entrance with kits in hand. Ellen's face went pale as she shielded the scene from cameras shouting for space. The assailant was dragged away in cuffs, his face twisted but silent while the deputies secured the perimeter. Jack refused to release Max, his hand firm on the dog's neck, feeling the steady thrum of life beneath the wound. The medics tried to move Max onto a stretcher, but the shepherd resisted, pressing against Jack's leg with stubborn strength. Every attempt to separate them made Max growl low, not in anger, but in refusal. The vet, called in by the marshals, urged Jack to let them restrain the dog for treatment. Jack shook his head. "He won't leave me. Not now." Max's eyes locked on Jack's, the bond unbroken even as pain shuddered through his frame. Blood stained Jack's hands, but he kept his grip calm, stroking Max's head while guiding the medics where to apply pressure. The dog trembled but never backed away, every breath drawn with the effort of a soldier refusing retreat. Ellen knelt beside them, her hand on Jack's shoulder, whispering that Max had saved him again, that the whole world had just witnessed what loyalty looked like in flesh and blood. Around them, cameras captured the scene, but for Jack, the world had narrowed to one life pressing against his own. The vet urged once more, saying the wound was deep, that Max needed immediate transport to the animal hospital. Jack agreed, but only if he stayed beside him. Deputies cleared a path, and Jack climbed into the vehicle with Max on the stretcher pressed tight against his knee. The shepherd's paw rested across Jack's leg as though to anchor them both. Sirens wailed, carrying them through streets blurred by speed. Inside the ambulance, Jack whispered steady words into Max's ear, telling him he was strong, telling him he had carried them through worse. At the clinic, doctors moved swiftly, prepping for surgery, but Max refused sedation until Jack bent close, forehead against fur, and promised he would not leave. The dog eased, then trusting the voice that had guided him through fire and blasts. Ellen waited outside the sterile doors, pacing with clenched fists, her face etched with fury at a system that had turned loyalty into a battlefield. Cross appeared at her side, murmuring that this was no coincidence that enemies who failed in court had turned to knives. Hours dragged. When the vet finally emerged, his gown marked with blood, he reported that Max had survived the procedure. The blade had missed vital organs by inches, but recovery would be grueling. Jack was allowed in, seated by Max's side as the shepherd stirred groggily, eyes finding him instantly tail-thumping once against the table despite the pain. The dog tried to rise, but Jack pressed him down gently, whispering that rest was his mission now. Even as the staff urged rest and restricted contact, Max would not allow distance. Every time Jack shifted to stand, the shepherd's head lifted in protest, eyes following until he returned. The vet sighed, admitting there was little use in forcing separation. "He has chosen his place," the doctor said quietly. Jack smiled faintly through exhaustion. "He always has." News of the attack spread rapidly. Outside the clinic, reporters delivered stories of loyalty written not in words, but in blood. Veterans gathered, leaving flags and tokens at the door. The nation began to see that this was not about custody on paper, but about a bond forged in sacrifice. Colonel Davis, watching from afar, felt the weight of every regulation he had quoted. Jack held Max's paw in his hand, his voice low. "You saved me again, partner. They'll try to pull us apart, but we'll face them together." Max's eyes closed steady, breathing returning, but his paw remained firm in Jack's grip, the vow unspoken, yet undeniable. In the corridor outside, footsteps of investigators approached, carrying news that the man with the knife was not acting alone. The following morning, the courthouse filled again, though the atmosphere carried the gravity of a nation now watching closely. News of the attack had reached every paper and screen, and images of Max bleeding on the courthouse steps had turned into a symbol of devotion. Jack walked carefully, Max beside him with a fresh bandage along his flank, the dog moving slower but steady, refusing to remain behind. Deputies cleared a quiet path, spectators bowing heads as the pair entered. Judge Whitaker called the session to order, his gavel striking once with emphasis. He announced that new testimony and documents had arrived that might alter the course of the proceedings. Ellen Pierce stood and requested that her next witness be called. The clerk's voice rang clear. Sergeant Tom Reynolds. A tall man in plain clothes rose from the gallery, his frame solid, though his gait carried the limp of someone who had known too many roads of war. He raised his hand, swore his oath, and took the stand. His eyes met Jack's for a moment, a flicker of shared memory passing between them. Reynolds began in a voice steady but charged with weight. He spoke of Afghanistan, a patrol through narrow valleys where rock walls funneled every sound. The unit had been on edge, rumors of ambush thick in the air. He recalled Max pulling at the leash, dragging Jack toward cover against a ridge. Jack had trusted the signal called for a halt, and seconds later the mountainside erupted with gunfire. But because Max had warned them early, the entire platoon had shifted positions and returned fire from safety, breaking the ambush before it could close its trap. 30 men walked away that day because of that dog, Reynolds said firmly. You can train detection. You can drill obedience, but you cannot train whatever it is that makes a creature throw himself between a bullet and a friend. That is not property. That is brotherhood. The gallery erupted in murmurs of agreement. Veterans nodded. Civilians wiped at their eyes. Jack sat with his jaw tight, the memory vivid. Max resting at his feet with the calmness of one who never sought applause. Ellen pressed Reynolds gently, asking if he had ever doubted Max's instincts. Reynolds shook his head. Never. If Max said danger, we listened. It saved our lives more than once. His testimony filled the chamber with something stronger than law-shared truth. Colonel Davis rose to question Reynolds, but his tone was strained. He asked whether Max's performance could be attributed to specialized conditioning. Reynolds answered with conviction. Conditioning doesn't explain what I saw. That dog moved before bullets flew. He knew in his bones. You can't write that in a manual. The exchange left Davis unsettled, his usual authority blunted. Before Ellen could close, a marshal entered with a sealed envelope marked classified. He approached the bench and handed it to Whitaker, who frowned, broke the seal, and read silently. The room held its breath. The judge adjusted his glasses, reread a line, then spoke. This document is a personnel record from Army Archives. It lists military working dog Max, serial number 7K14, as destroyed in combat following the Kandahar incident. A stunned silence fell. The judge continued. According to military code, such designation means the asset is considered no longer part of Army inventory. In plain terms, under law, he does not belong to the Army. The gallery gasped. Ellen seized the moment. Your Honor, that entry confirms what Sergeant Harris has argued. Max is not property of the Army. The Army itself recorded his status as ended. Yet he lives because of resilience and care. That makes him free, not disposable. Jack clenched Max's leash, overwhelmed by the weight of those words. For years he had carried guilt over that day, believing Max's sacrifice had nearly ended them both. Now the very system that claimed to own Max had already written him off. Colonel Davis rose, face taut. Your Honor, with respect, the designation may have been clerical, a mistake in record-keeping. Whitaker fixed him with a hard stare. Colonel, this is not an isolated line. It is official notation, and it changes the framework of this case entirely. He ordered the record entered as evidence. Reporters scribbled at a frantic pace, their eyes alight with the story unfolding. Reynolds leaned forward on the stand. The Army may call him destroyed. We called him Savior. If that file says he no longer belongs to them, then let him belong to where he chose all along with Jack. His words drew applause before Whitaker's gavel restored silence. But the judge did not scold. Instead, he sat for a long moment, pen resting motionless, as if weighing justice itself. Ellen turned to Jack, whispering that this was the breakthrough they needed. Jack nodded, his eyes locked on Max, who lifted his head and looked back steady as always. Around them, the gallery buzzed with the realization that the ground beneath the Army's claim had cracked wide. But just as hope swelled, the marshal who delivered the file stepped forward again, requesting to speak with the judge in chambers. His face carried the strain of urgent news. Whitaker's brow furrowed as he excused himself briefly. The door to chambers closed, leaving the room in uneasy anticipation, the sense that the story was far from settled. The courtroom waited in taut silence as Judge Whitaker returned from chambers, the sealed envelope of classified records still in his hand. His face revealed nothing, but the weight of the moment settled on every person in the room. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his gavel once, and spoke with deliberate clarity. This court has reviewed testimony, examined evidence, and considered both regulation and truth. What stands before us is not merely a question of property, but of loyalty, sacrifice, and honor. The gallery leaned forward, breaths held. Jack sat still. Max at his feet, the dog's bandaged flank rising and falling with calm certainty, his gaze fixed on the man at the bench. Ellen Pierce kept her eyes steady on the judge, her hands clasped but her knuckles white. Colonel Davis shifted uneasily, the erosion of authority evident in his tightened jaw. Whitaker continued, his voice resonant in the chamber. The Army's own record declared Max destroyed in combat, striking him from inventory. By law, such designation means he is no longer under military custody. Yet Max lives not by paperwork but by will and devotion. This court finds that he is not an asset of the United States Army. He is a soldier who has already given his service. The gallery erupted in applause, the sound rising like a wave. The judge lifted his gavel but did not strike, allowing the moment to wash over the room. He raised his voice above the noise. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that Max is formally retired from military service and released to Sergeant Jack Harris. Furthermore, the record shall reflect recognition of Max as a decorated war dog whose courage saved American lives. The room shook with the force of approval. Veterans stood saluting in unison. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed without pause. Jack bowed his head, overcome, his hand gripping Max's leash with trembling strength. Ellen pressed a hand against her chest, eyes glistening, whispering that the fight had been worth every moment. Davis remained silent, shoulders slumped, the weight of defeat heavy but tempered by a reluctant respect. The clerk read the official statement into the record, marking Max's status as retired and commended. For the first time, Jack exhaled with relief rather than tension. He leaned down, whispered into Max's ear, and the shepherd thumped his tail once as though he understood. Outside, the courthouse steps were already filling with citizens' flags, waving reporters ready to broadcast the ruling. Deputies escorted Jack and Max through the side corridor, but when they emerged into the open air, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. Veterans in uniform saluted, children waved flags, and voices chanted Max's name. Jack paused on the steps, the cameras capturing every detail. He straightened his posture, lifted his hand in a crisp salute, directed not at the flag above, but at the dog by his side. Max looked up, ears pricked, meeting his handler's eyes with unwavering trust. Jack lowered his voice, speaking words meant for only one companion, though the world would hear them. "You saved my life again, buddy. Now it's my turn to protect you." The crowd fell silent, struck by the simplicity and weight of the vow. Then applause thundered, rolling across the steps like a tide. Reporters surged forward with questions, but Jack kept his hand on Max, moving slowly toward the waiting vehicle. Ellen guided him, shielding space, while Cross lingered at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable, as though the story's end was only a chapter in something larger. Davis stood at the courthouse door, watching with a heavy heart, saluting quietly before turning away. The judge, still inside, looked out from a high window, his hand resting on the sill, satisfied that justice had honored both law and loyalty. The motorcade moved slowly through streets lined with people. Windows opened, flags waved, voices cheered. Jack leaned back, his hand never leaving Max's head. The shepherd rested calmly, eyes scanning the world outside, no longer as a soldier under orders, but as a companion walking into peace. Jack allowed himself a small smile, the kind that comes when battle is over, but memory endures. By the time they reached the clinic for follow-up care, a crowd had gathered there too, laying wreaths and tokens at the entrance. Jack carried Max inside, refusing to let anyone else take the leash. The vet examined the wound again, promising full recovery with time. Jack stayed close, whispering steady words of comfort. Max closed his eyes, not from weakness, but from the trust that comes only from years of shared fire. That evening, news stations replayed the footage of Jack's salute, his vow echoing across the nation. Commentators called it a turning point in how the country viewed its war dogs. Letters poured into the courthouse, thanking Judge Whitaker, honoring Max, and praising Jack's perseverance. In living rooms across America, veterans nodded quietly, seeing their own stories reflected in the bond of man and dog. Jack spent that night at home for the first time in weeks, Max curled at his side. The house filled with a silence that was no longer heavy, but healing. He sat by the window, watching lights flicker across the neighborhood, and whispered once more, "We're home, partner, this time for good." Max's ears twitched, his breathing, even the rhythm of peace replacing the drumbeat of war. Max proved that loyalty cannot be owned, only earned. Which part of this story struck you the hardest? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're tuning in from. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and give this video a like to help us share it with others who believe in the same bond.